we go. All righty. So let's kick it off. So first of all, I'd like to officially welcome Celestina Raggi to our webinar. And just a little bit about Celestina, so everyone knows before we jump in, is Celestina is currently the Vice President of Human Resources for Emerson Middle East and Africa. In that role, she leads the people strategy across a highly diverse, multicultural country region. She has over 20 years of experience in global human resources, is a trusted advisor to senior leaders on organizational transformation, leadership capability, and inclusive growth. As a senior HR leader and change partner, Celestina has built and transformed HR functions across multiple continents, including Europe, the Middle East, and Africa, supporting organizations through periods of growth, complexity, and cultural evolution. Her work spans talent and leadership development, performance and career frameworks, succession planning, and diversity, equity, and inclusion, always being closely aligned to the business strategy and long-term sustainability. Before joining Emerson, Celestina worked as a business and executive coach, and she supported leaders and teams navigating change. She holds a degree in cultural mediation and a master's in human resources. And she brings a strong cross-cultural perspective, combining strategic insight with pragmatic, people-centered execution. So a big, big welcome to Celestina for joining us for this webinar. So what I'd love to do is, you all have been hearing me talk for a while. Celestina, I'd love to give you an opportunity to say anything additional about yourself and any just introductions you'd like to do before we kick off.
Thanks, Tiffany. I think you've painted a picture of me that, listening from this side was like, wow, am I all that? So I think I want to add maybe a couple of personal notes to the business description, because I think we're going to talk about also my, business experience in the fireside chat today. I think personally, okay, in case you didn't realize, I'm Italian. You can definitely get from my accent and from the song that I picked earlier, which, I hope it was okay also for a global audience. But again, it's about getting to know other cultures. So I thought it was a good pick, so to learn a little bit about my background as well. Personally, I have a daughter who is 28 years old, and she's back in Italy. So I'm currently on my own here in the Middle East. And some of the passions that I have, which I'm sure I will mention later today, but it's definitely traveling. I've been to more than 50 countries, and and I continue to count. Unfortunately, the current situation is holding me up, but I will start again soon. And I'm a big fan of reading, and reading a little bit of everything, but I really enjoy reading. And as I was chatting with you earlier, I really like to spend time on the beach listening to my favorite audiobooks. So yeah, that's a bit about me.
Excellent. Thank you, Celestina. And we'll learn more as we go through our conversation. So I do want to just take a minute, Celestina, because you mentioned kind of the current situation that's going on just around the world. And before we kind of officially jump into our fireside chat, I do want to take a moment to acknowledge that there's a lot happening around the world right now, particularly across the Middle East, right? And I think many of us, probably on this call and further have been impacted, whether directly or indirectly. And that shapes like how we're able to show up, right? It shapes what's happening with us personally, which we then bring into our work, right? We bring into our leadership, because we're all complex people. And I just love to start our conversation by hearing from you, first of all, and just like, how are you doing, right? Sitting in kind of the midst of this, being located in Dubai. And how are you finding navigating, supporting your team and the broader organization to continue moving forward, especially in the midst of all of this uncertainty?
Yeah, I think, Tiffany, you have really pointed to the two main points. There is the personal side and the professional side. I think from a personal perspective, and maybe, it goes with me not been a very anxious person, but I really feel grounded and safe. I think for those who are in Dubai and most of the GCC country we have experienced, there is a lot that the governments here are doing in terms of keeping us safe. So I think this has helped me really going through this situation with a very balanced approach, but at the same time remaining aware of what is happening around us. I think the professional side is much more complex than that. You know, it's really intense. I would say most of the time we are in what we call the crisis management mode. And crisis management means making quick decisions, most of the time with limited information. And we know that each decision that we make has an impact on people, either in the short term or it will have in the long term, particularly from a safety and security perspective. So I think, you know, there is no playbook to do that. You know, we research, we try to find, but in the end, you know, it's really no playbook, just trying to do the best that you can. And that sometimes can have bring a heavy weight on you. What I'm learning, and thanks, you know, this has been helpful, some of the work that I've done myself in the past, is to focus on what I can control or what we can control. Because, I think there's no point in responding to uncertainty looking at what we can control. What we can control is there. But the response to uncertainty, if we focus on what we can control and keeping the people in the center of what we do, can really help developing that resilient and constructive mindset. So I think, you know, we cannot escape uncertainty. It's more about how we navigate it that really makes a difference.
Yeah, and I really like how you talk about that, what is in our sphere of control, right? And that's something that we talk a lot to our clients about, is what's in that sphere of control and also sphere of influence, and then what's outside of our control. And if we really focus in on the things that are in our control and influence, we actually can make change and we can shift things. If we're always focused on the things that are outside of our control, then we put ourselves in this place of an inability to move because we feel like we just can't control, when we actually can control and influence a lot more than we think we can. And I love that we have such a diverse group on the call today. We have folks, Celestina, from your organization, Emerson. We have other external folks, whether they're partners of EIC, friends of EIC, clients of EIC. And so I'm really looking forward to this being just a holistic conversation of understanding how we can each take what you're sharing with us and bring it into our own unique perspectives and worlds and what works well for, for us.
Totally, and I'm sure, nobody has, as I said earlier, there is no playbook for this uncertain situation. There is no playbook for, for influence or for navigating complexity, but it's just, hearing from different experience can shape us better. That's the advantage.
Exactly. So I want to jump into my next question for you, which I'm sure is really going to be something that folks can figure out. How do we take some of your learnings forward on this? Because in my bio, when I mentioned the bio of you, when I shared that, it talked about the fact that you've built your career, right, over Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. What did you learn early on about adapting your leadership style to different cultures? Because, that's 3 continents. There are hundreds and hundreds of cultures just within one of those continents. And so would love to hear how you've navigated and adapted that, like, over your career and earlier in your career to be successful.
I think, Tiffany, one very important, I will start with the end, but then I'll go back to the end at the end. I think one of the things is that in leadership, you can have the same intent, but the expression needs to change based on the context you are in. So I just give you a personal example, right? At the very beginning of my career, I felt that being clear and being direct would mean being effective. And I think I've seen it work most of the time, not all the time, but the majority of the time, it worked in Europe. I think, especially when you know the environment you are in, you can have that. However, when I moved to the Middle East and Africa, for example, but I had this experience, in other global environment, how things are said, who is in the room, when the setting really can make a change. So I will share something that happened to me in my very early days in the Middle East and Africa. I was attending this meeting with the leadership team, and in my experience in Europe, when we were meeting with the leadership team, it was okay to be confrontational, to say things and challenge others. So I come to the Middle East and Africa, first or second meeting, I don't recall, and I do exactly the same. I challenge one opinion, sharing my perspective. And then I realized that the energy shifts. Suddenly I see something is off. And then, okay, the meeting goes on. At the end, I asked a colleague of mine, which I started to build some relationship, if she could give me some feedback. And basically, her feedback was, what you said was not wrong. It's the way you said it, and especially the timing you said it that was not right. And I think this has really helped me understand that it's about adapting to the different situation in order to be effective. So that effectiveness comes from adaptation, and that results in the impact. I think there is a clear distinctions between the value or the things that we want to communicate and the behavior, so the how we do that. And I think one of the most important lessons for me is that, taking time to observe and before acting, understand the context, understand the dynamics, is one of the most important traits of leadership.
I love that. And actually, just as you're talking about that, Celestina, what's popping into my mind, and I don't know if you've read this book yet, but it's called The Culture Map. And I was actually just, I'm just copying it because I'm going to throw it into the chat. There you go. Everybody can see it. I'll put it in the chat as well, because what you're saying, Celestina, is exactly what I feel like that book taught me, which it's the how, right? And it's being, having self-awareness around learning the culture in which you're stepping into, and how best to not only communicate, how to get feedback, how to disagree, right? How to engage and partner, what all of those pieces look like. It can be different in your culture than other cultures, and neither is right or wrong, but it's being respectful of how do I engage to be able to make sure that I'm bringing folks in and bringing folks along and being part of the team. So I love that. And I'll throw that in the chat. So if others are interested in that book, I think Celestina and I both highly recommend it. And it's a great book when you think about the focus of this webinar around bridging cultures. It really supports that. So Celestina, I want to move into the second focus of building influence. So we talked a little bit about bridging cultures. And so I'd love for you to share a little bit about, in the environments you have worked in, what does influence actually look like? And how have you learned to build it, especially in multicultural environments and when that's not your native culture, right? So how do you build influence in those spaces?
Yeah, I think my lesson actually was from my early days. I think I always knew that influence is not about title, role, or authority. Sometimes you can use some of these to kind of force your decisions or your opinions, but influence is something else. And again, when I was about 20 plus years ago, I was the first female leader in a very heavily male environment. Additionally, when I took that role of leadership, I was reporting to the European leadership team. And at that point, I moved from being an individual contributor to a peers of leaders who were before my managers. So you see why I'm going there, because at the beginning I thought, okay, I already have a relationship with them. They had good opinions of me. They were giving me very positive feedback. But influence completely changed when I took the role. And I realized that I had to kind of earn it again. So the first learning is that influence is something that you have to earn. Sorry, it's not granted. And at least in my experience, I earned it through three major things. One was obviously the competence, the knowledge, what I can bring to the table in terms of content, because I am supposed to be the subject matter expert for the function that I represent. Second is the trust, and trust can be built differently in a different setting, but for me, it's being true to who you are, walk the talk, keep your intent. You can change the ways, but the things that anchor you need to be there. And the third piece is being self-aware. Self-aware helps you understand what your main traits are and how you can adjust accordingly. So I think I was lucky at the time. I had an executive coach who helped me understand what were the strengths that I could leverage to build that influence, but also what I needed to change or what I needed to flex in order to make an impact. So for example, at that time, I realized that in most of the time, I should help them get to the decision instead of me telling them what the right decision was. If you see, so that kind of shared ownership, I think has helped me create that sense of influence. So today, when I know influence is important, I do no longer see influence as persuasion. In my mind, in my early stages, was influence equal persuasion. No, for me, influence is alignment, and specifically for me, it's connecting the business, the context, and the people in an authentic and respectful way.
I just want to go back to those three things you said, Celestina, because I think that that's key and really important for the folks listening to this webinar around competence, trust, and self-awareness. And the reason I want to go back to that is because I feel like competence, people feel pretty comfortable with, okay, I can be competent in my technical area of expertise, right? Building trust takes the competence and the self-awareness, right? In order for that trust to be formed. And that self-awareness means like, I'm self-aware of how I'm showing up. I'm self-aware of the environment that I'm stepping into. And I'm also self-aware of making sure I'm aligning my intention and my impact. Because I think that's the big piece when you talked about bridging cultures, is your intention may be one thing, the impact of what you've done and how you've done it may be something very different. And those are three simple words, and they're very hard to do. And I think part of what's valuable in getting strong and having a level of capability around those three is asking people for feedback. So I want to go back to what you said, Celestina, earlier, which is you pulled a colleague aside when you were like, something's not sitting right when I came out of that meeting, something was off, and you asked for feedback. And I truly believe feedback is a gift. And if we are open to that gift, it is a way of people being kind. And I also just watched a podcast, actually it was Trevor Noah, and it was great. And he was talking about the difference between being nice and being kind.
Oh, yes.
Right? And being kind is an act of niceness, right? But like, because you're kind doesn't mean that you're nice. And he gave it was actually him and Simon Sinek who were talking about this. And so Simon talked about the fact of you giving feedback to someone is kind. You could be nice and not tell the person the hard thing. That's being nice. But it's not being kind to that person. It's not helping them build their competence and their trust and their self-awareness. So also, as we think about, one, our ability to ask for feedback, and also how we respond when we observe someone in this situation of trying to navigate cultures, trying to figure out how to develop influences, are we being kind and offering and asking, would you be open to some feedback on what I observed, right? And so that's just something that popped to mind for me, Celestina, as you were kind of walking through this. Yeah, I want to move on to, when we talk about influence, talk about kind of this bridging of cultures, and you have to navigate, right? And you have to shift a little bit of how you would normally operate in order to be able to bridge these cultures. And that allows us to do some flexing, right? We have to flex and we have to hold flexing and adapting with also being true to who we are, because we also don't want to overly turn into someone that is not true to ourselves, right? So I would love to hear a little more, Celestina, about how do you balance that? How do you balance adapting from a cultural perspective and having that self-awareness and building that trust and competence, but also being really true, to who you are as a leader and as an individual?
It's I wish I had the perfect recipe, because it's something I'm still working on daily. And I remember having this discussion with a mentee very recently, very similar, someone who is a very strongly value driven. I am, I recently also worked with a coach and look at my strengths, and values are really something that are super important for me. So I think I believed, and unfortunately sometimes I still do, that adaptation means compromising. So if I look at my values, I really want to stick to my value. If I deviate from my values, I definitely, I'm compromising. What I really try to force myself to think is this: for every situation, is this a value conflict, or is it just a different style that I need to adopt because it's necessary for me to have the impact that my intent plans to have? And just by asking this question, is it about value, or is it about style? Is it about the setting? I think helps me very often move to the next step. There are certainly some non-negotiables I want to anchor on. For example, how people are treated. They need to be treated fairly. They need to be treated, with dignity, with respect. That's something that I don't compromise on. How decisions are made, but everything else, pace, tone, I don't know, my visibility, everything else can flex. So I think it's about showing consistently in intent, but again, changing the way, flexing the way you do things. And I think this is still a very, something that I'm learning every day, honestly, Tiffany. So if you have any advice, I'll be happy to take it.
Well, I just think, again, like the little nugget you're putting out, Celestina, I just want to double down on. And I just love this separation of values, from preferences. And I think that's hard to do sometimes because our values are such a part of who we are. I'm curious, just like, how do you do that? Like, how do you make that distinction of, is this value or is this preference? Is it some time that you spend, introspective time? Do you take a step back and say, look, before I make a determination on how I'm going to move forward with this? I'm just curious what your process is around that.
Yeah, I think for me, it's about sitting back, really, because I know now it's about the self-awareness. And I think this is one of the things that over time I've been able to build. I know that I have this tendency, that it's in my style to connect values with effectiveness and, not letting go. So I know that, and through self-awareness, I need to stop myself. There are situations that come to my mind. They're a bit, I would say, confidential, so I cannot share these examples at the moment. But it's more about, yes, stepping back, but also sometimes asking my peers, my colleague. I know that I have colleagues who think very differently than me, so I would reach out to them and say, okay, is this really value driven, or is it because of the style or because of the environment we are in? And their different thinking helps me review my thoughts as well.
Yeah, and I think that just goes back to what we talked about before, Celestina, right? Which is that feedback, like just having that safe space that you can go to and say, look, like, can I bounce something off of you? Can I get your perspective on this? The model that's coming to mind, and I'll also throw this in the chat for folks in case it's helpful, is I don't know if you have heard of or familiar with the ladder of inference. And this was developed by Chris Argyris. And the reason this comes to mind for me is because it is it shows us, and this is a psychology mental model for those that are listening, and it talks about how we take action as humans, like what causes us to take any action, to respond in a specific way, to engage in a specific way. And it talks about that in a moment in time, we go up what Chris Argyris calls this ladder of inference, right? Where we observe something that happened in the world, right? And Celestina, you talked about like your non-negotiable values, and then the value system where you can take a step back and say, maybe that's not really about my value system. Maybe that's about a cultural preference, right? That's not about me. It's about what's happening outside of me. And what tends to happen is that's not as humans, our regular way of engaging, because it's taking that step back. Our way of moving to action is we see something happen in the world. So we observe an experience, data, right? And it's like almost as a video might capture it. You're going to remember, Celestina, this is that thing that happened, right? Then you're going to select the things that are important to you out of that snippet, out of that video, because it's based on your belief system and on your values. Like, these are the things that are most important that happen. And then we add meaning to it. We add our own cultural and personal meaning to, I saw this thing happen and this is what that meant, right? Even that may not have been what it meant to the individuals that were actually experiencing it, but this is what it meant for me based on my cultural and personal values. And then I make assumptions based on those things that I said the meaning is, right? And then, but from those assumptions, and I draw conclusions, it is that thing. This is the thing that happened. And that's how I adopt beliefs about the world. And then I take action on that, right? So now I'm moving to action. And all of it stems from our cultural and our values, our cultural value system and our personal value system. And to take a step back from that is not how our brain is wired. And so that's where that self-awareness piece comes in, Celestina, that you keep talking about, which I think is so important, is sometimes we have to take a step back and say, the meaning that I put on that is actually not what that meant. That was the meaning I am putting on it because of my own values and my own cultural upbringing, but that may not be the meaning in this space.
Oh, yeah.
So I'll throw that in the chat for folks. If folks want to look up the ladder of inference, I highly recommend it. And it's just, again, a personal self-awareness tool to ensure that we're not running up that ladder too fast and moving into action, but we're actually taking a moment at each step to say, is this really what I observed, or is it what I'm putting on the meaning of what I observed? So Celestina, let's move to the next question that I'd love to hear about from you. You talked in the beginning that you're Italian, right? And you've done work over Europe, over the continent of Europe. You've also done this work on, on continents where you're not from. You're not from the Middle East, you're not from Africa. Have there been moments when your own cultural background either strengthened or challenged your ability to influence and lead in these environments?
Yes, both, I would say, to answer in a nutshell. I think, from my background, but just, apart from my roots, which are Italian, obviously, I think what you mentioned when you were sharing my biography was that, by degree, I'm a cultural mediator. So I've always been very interested in cultures. I spoke about my passion for travel. Travel for me is just more than about seeing places. It's more understanding, the people, how things are done, why they're done in a certain way. So I think from very early in my life, I was really drawn to international environments. I worked abroad, but always in Europe when I was young in university. At that time, though moving from Italy to another country in Europe was a big, big journey, so much more different than it is today. And then, my plan was to move abroad. My plan was to move to the US after university, but then life unfolded a bit differently. I fell in love, got married, and, things happened. So I ended up staying in Italy. But from the very beginning of my career, I worked in multinational environment. And I think what has helped me doing was really being starting to understand these cultural differences, although being based in what was my original country. And I think this has taught me something to start with, is that you don't need necessarily to relocate. Yes, if you have the chance, it's much better. But even if you stay where you are, it's about curiosity, being open, and intentional effort to try and understand the others and their differences. I think when you ask me about my what has helped me as what has hindered me, again, I think from my background, which is a combination of the culture I come from, my family orientation, etc., the strengths probably lie in building relationship and also a certain level of emotional intelligence. And this has definitely helped me when working with people from different cultures and different backgrounds. Because emotional intelligence also helps you stop, listen, observe, and which is very important when you are in different settings. What has challenged me, well, there are multiple things, but I think one of the things that has challenged me most is my expressiveness. I think I've mentioned before, I like to say openly what I think. I like to get the same, open from others. But I've noticed, especially when I moved to the Middle East, because there is an influence of also Asian cultures here, which are much more reserved. My expressiveness was not always welcome and the best approach. But I think, all in all, we have talked about earlier. I think if you put yourself and start thinking about what surrounds you, and you're self-aware of what could hinder you, you're still gonna make mistakes, but this is gonna allow you to progress.
I love that. I love that. And I think that's the thing of just giving ourselves a little bit of grace, right? When we're stepping into these new environments and knowing that it's a learning journey, right? For all of us. So Celestina, I have one more question for you. Then I want to open it up for any questions that we have from folks on the call. So those that are listening in, please do open up that Q&A box that we talked about. Again, just a reminder, bottom right-hand corner, the 9 dots that are in the shape of a box, click on that. Click on Q&A and drop your questions in there, and we'll spend our last 10 or 15 minutes making sure we have a chance to address those. But Celestina, going back to what you just said, this is actually kind of aligned with not my final question, because that'll be at the end of the session, but my soon to be close to final question is, we're all still learning, right? And we're all still we're humans, and we're going to be constantly learning. So I would love to hear, as you reflect on your journey, right, kind of bridging cultures, navigating systems, building influence, what capability has been most critical to your success, and what do you feel like you're still learning, yourself?
Okay. I probably, I'm going to repeat myself, but definitely this interest of becoming self-aware has been one of the things that has really helped me. I have taken so many personality tests or behavioral preferences. I'm really always curious to understand better what are, obviously my values, that is definitely important, but also what is my leadership style, my default leadership style. I know, for example, that I tend to lead with coaching, or what are my triggers? Because, if I understand who I am and how I lead, etc., that allows me to adapt intentionally. I need to make an intentional effort, but whenever my style is not appropriate, I can adapt, still keeping my authenticity. The second piece, and I use that when I mentioned about emotional intelligence, is about listening, observing. Listening for me is with all the senses. It's not just listening with your ears. It's observing what is around you. So, for example, in every context, listening takes a different shape and form. You need to learn how to listen to silence, because silence means something, right? So this is super important, especially when you have those contexts where authority is not necessarily the thing that leads, but influence is the thing that leads. And I think these elements have helped me gain credibility across cultures, but also sometimes across functions or across levels, when you need to deal with people around, from different levels or different backgrounds. What I'm still learning, lots of things. I think one thing that I'm learning still is patience, although I think I have improved so much, but I wish all the time, I wish that change was much faster, or I wish that I could influence much faster, or I wish I could understand things much faster. So I think in the end, probably it's been, my biggest thing is, my biggest capability is stay grounded in who I am, but acknowledge that there is so much that I still need to learn and continue this learning process.
Oh, thank you. No, I think that's really important. And I just want to point out again, something you said that I think is critical for folks to recognize is change is slow and it does require patience. And I had a previous leader that told me this, and I just thought it was a great analogy for change. And he talked about the fact that change is like transformational change is like the changing of seasons, where when you go right from autumn to winter, it's not all of a sudden one day. It's you start to see a leaf turn colors when you're on a walk. You start to see a few trees where the leaves have fallen off, and you're like, oh, wow, change is in the process of happening. And that's how organizational and transformational change happens. That's how cultural change and transformation happens. It happens little by little, but you have to be paying attention to it. To see it, you have to be patient to lead through it. And so I do think that those are really important pieces to have. All right, Celestina, we're going to move to some questions from participants. So yes, we have a couple of questions in our Q&A bucket. So I'll go ahead and read those out, Celestina, and then have you respond. So we have a question from Jenna, and Jenna says, how does influence differ across cultures where hierarchy is valued versus cultures that prioritize collaboration? What has been your experience with that?
Interesting, because this is probably, one of the things that I have also experienced when moving from Europe to the Middle East and Africa. Although I must admit, at the beginning of my career in Europe, because I have a few years of experience, the culture was much more hierarchical than it is today, and it is still somewhere. But again, I talked about, my initial experience in a very male-dominated environment where, the males were the ones with certain degrees and female, lower degrees, hierarchy was there. But definitely it has changed. And I think one thing that I have to learn in this part of the world is that hierarchy matters most. I deal better with flattened hierarchy, but I also realized that flattened hierarchy can be disruptive or can create discomfort in some people. So I start with hierarchy by saying that you need to acknowledge if, how hierarchy is perceived in a certain environment and adapt to that. As I said, at the very beginning, my style with my team, for example, was like flatten hierarchy. But I had to change a bit because it didn't work well with my team that was used to a more hierarchical setup. I still believe, though, that hierarchy can help make decisions in the short term, quick decisions. For example, now in crisis, following hierarchy is super critical. You cannot challenge the decision too much. If the boss says, we follow the boss. It's needed because decisions need to be made quickly. We challenge when it's time to challenge. I think, though, that over time, influence still is based on the three elements that I mentioned earlier, which is around the competence, around the trust, and around self-awareness. And trust, which is the biggest piece. Competence we talked about, self-awareness we talked about. I think trust is a combination of consistency in intent, but also collaboration, but also showing up differently, maintaining the same intent, showing up differently in the different environments, in the different settings. I don't know if you have anything to add, Tiffany, from your perspective, but.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head with that. And again, I just am taking your nuggets and anchoring on them, because one thing you said about trust is consistency, and that is big to build trust. When you're building trust with someone, they want to see that you're not just acting in a certain way that one time or on these occasions, but they can consistently know how you're going to show up and how you're going to engage with the world and what your value system is and how you make decisions and what those anchor values are. And so when they see that consistency, then they know, oh, I can trust Celestina, I can trust Tiffany, and how they're going to engage or show up. So I think that's so important. Let's go to our second question, also from Jenna, which I think is great. And this one is, what are some common cultural blind spots that leaders often overlook when working in diverse teams, and how can they proactively address them?
Well, I think the major blind spot is leading the same way you have always been leading, using the same style you have always been using. So I cannot say that I have seen a common blind spot, except this, maybe, for a European, again, my experience coming to a different type of environment, it could be, being too direct. But for an Asian, I'm just using that example, going to a different context, that blind spot would be being feeling that they are heard even if they don't speak up, because that's okay normally in that culture, right? So I think that the blind spots are mostly coming from our lack of self-awareness. And maybe that self-awareness comes also from lack of experience in some cases. I'm not saying that people are not interested in understanding more about themselves. I mentioned some of my blind spots that I had. I mentioned my blind spot about hierarchy. I can tell you, when I mentioned on purpose, I know that my preferred leadership style is coaching, is because I receive feedback that style doesn't work in certain environments. So I would say that, in order to address is probably, I always believe that getting feedback is the most effective way of doing it. And in order to receive feedback, and Tiffany, you talked about it earlier, I think you need to be really open for feedback. I've met many people, and I'm sure you have too, that say, oh yeah, I want to receive feedback, but then, they really are resistant to that. So I think and I am one of those who initially, in the past used to take feedback not really well, because it really hurt my ego, right? But I think that's, if people are open to feedback, there is no blind spot that cannot be corrected.
No, that's excellent. I think that's really, really important advice, and definitely around recognizing, right, that the blind spots, we don't know our own blind spots. So asking folks about it and just saying, do you have any perspective, is great. So we have another question, and this will probably be our last one from the group, because then I have a final question for you, Celestina, is what are short-term 1 to 2 year and long-term 10-year plus methods of building influence across a globally matrix company like Emerson as someone starting their journey?
Okay. Again, this is based on my experience, and I'm just thinking what can be long-term and versus short-term. But I would say, let's start with, I believe that the first thing that needs to be clarified are, again, the non-negotiables. In the case of the global, the global interaction and the global matrix, it could be the why, why we are doing something. This is something that is non-negotiables. If it's, if you are the one leading, or, if you are on the other side, what are the outcomes that we need to achieve? These are the things that need to be clear. And I think they need to be clear. The way you make them clear is, it goes back to how you do it, which needs to be adjusted depending on who you are talking to. But these are the things that set the foundation. And on that, I think it's about understanding and balance with what are the local and different realities. So I think it's not being very firm of the things that need to stay, because they are so critical, but then being able to flex and adjust on the execution of the things that need to happen. So if, for someone who's trying to build in the short term or long term, is understanding what are you trying to achieve by building that that influence, and then making sure that you understand the different people you work with, creating a good network, a good connection, and work through that over time in order to ensure that what you have kind of defined as your success can be achieved over time. I think I was a bit confusing, but I hope you got the gist, Tiffany.
No, I think that's excellent. I think those non-negotiables are really important to have in showing the ability to be agile. I think in a globally matrix organization is really important, that adaptability that you talked about earlier. So that was Nitesh. I didn't mention the name, so thank you for that. And we had another question come in. So Celestina, we're going to ask that because we want to make sure we get everyone. So we'll ask you to answer this one quickly for us, and then we'll do our final closeout question. But Alina says, in a fast-paced networking culture, how can we make space for deeper, trust-driven relationships instead of rushing connections?
Well, I tell you how I do it. I'm not sure, if it would work for you, Alina, and because it will also depend on your style and what these connections for me. For me, first of all, is choosing what are the relationships that are really important and deep for me, in addition to, which value they can bring me to do my daily job is one thing, but what can I, what are the relationships I really want to build on over time? And for that, what I do, I schedule regular points of contacts. I'm a planner. I like to plan. Things can change, but I really need to have in my calendar, okay, if you are really important for me, once a month, once every 6 months, once a year, I want to connect with you, whether it's virtually, whether it's in person, whether it's just through a message. So for me, it's really knowing who are those relationships that are deeply important for me and cultivating them.
I love that, Celestina. Thank you. And with our last 3 minutes, I want to ask you kind of our closing question for everyone. And thank you all for providing the Q&A, and any additional questions that come in, throw them in. We will get those over to Celestina, and we can make sure that we send them out to everyone because we have everyone's email from the calendar invite. So please keep them coming in. But what is one piece of advice, Celestina, that you have for folks that are listening to this webinar now or may listen to it later about their ability to really be able to strongly bridge cultures and be effective in building influence? What would be that one piece of advice that you share to maybe newer, younger, midterm leaders?
I think, okay, one thing that I really learned probably over time is that especially in today's environment, in today's world, it's very important to know and understand what your compass is. We are very often in situation of uncertainty. We are very often in situation where we might lose a bit of track because of everything that is around us. So you can call it the North Star, you can call it the compass. There is another book, that you talk, as you're talking about books, there is a very interesting book that I read recently about defining your North Star. I think this is very important because that's where you ground yourself every time you might be lost. Then, I think it's about understanding what's around you, what's the system, not just the cultures, the system influence. For example, when you go into an organization and you see incentives, I'm just using an example because we haven't touched on that. What are those incentives? Which type of behavior are those incentives trying to reward? Because this gives you another sense of what is a system within a certain culture. And I think, for me, the other thing is always listen first around you. What are people that you meet are trying to protect? What success looks like for them, how you can help them achieve that success. Because this is definitely going to help you, especially when you join a different environment. And I think you mentioned it, Tiffany, earlier. I think we need to give ourselves grace. We need to be patient with ourselves and with others because mistake happens. But I think one important element is that we tend, as in human nature, to see mistakes as failures. And I had to turn that. For me, mistakes now, yes, they put me in a moment of discomfort, but I know that these are part of my learning curve. So I take that mistake, I embrace it, and then I move on.
That is excellent. And I think that's a huge part of right now. We're all trying to figure out how to navigate in this world that we're in. No one has been in this space before. And so learning from our mistakes, giving ourselves grace, making sure we're aware of how we can help others and how others can support us is so important. Celestina, thank you so much for your time, for your engagement. We so are grateful and appreciative that you joined us to support us on this webinar and to give all of your great experience to everyone. For those on the call, just a reminder, in the comments, you'll see the book that Celestina and I were recommending, the culture map, as well as the ladder of influence model that we discussed on the call. We will have this webinar posted on our YouTube page and on our website. So that website that we had there in the beginning, emergentconsulting.co. Please go there, and anyone that you think could benefit from this, they can watch it on the webinar as well. So thank you again, Celestina. So appreciate you. And thank you everyone for joining.
Really enjoyed the conversation. Talk to you soon. Bye,
Thanks,
everyone.
everyone. Bye.
Bye.